Good evening. I'm going to get us started. Good evening and welcome to the Annenberg School for Communication at the University of Pennsylvania. I have to emphasize University of Pennsylvania today because of our speaker today. And welcome as well to the 20th Annual Walter and Leonore Annenberg Distinguished Lecture in Communication. The Annenberg Lecture was established in 1992 by the Annenberg School alumni to honor the Annenbergs by bringing together alumni, faculty, graduate students, and other parts of the Penn community to hear from a leader in the academy or professional world of media and communication. Past speakers have included the Honorable Daniel Boorstin, the Librarian of Congress Emeritus, Haynes Johnson, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, best-selling author, and television commentator, Duncan Kenworthy, filmmaker and producer, and also an Annenberg alum, Barton Gregorian, president at the time of the Carnegie Corporation of New York, still is, Cass Sunstein, Carl N. Lewin Distinguished Service Professor of Jurisprudence at the University of Chicago Law School, as well as the Department of Political Science and the College at the University of Chicago, Shashi Tharoor, Undersecretary General for Communication and Public Information at the United Nations, Paul Steiger, Editor-in-Chief, President, and Chief Executive of the online investigative reporting unit ProPublica.org, and former Managing Editor of the Wall Street Journal, and last year, David Remnick, Editor of the New Yorker magazine. Today's speaker adds luster to this already luminary group. Before introducing him, however, I would like to publicly thank the staff of ASC for all the hard work they put into tonight's event, and in particular our events planner, Deborah Williams. So, and now to our guest speaker. Introducing tonight's speaker is a special pleasure for me because of our parallel roles as deans of the Annenberg schools, our similar paths of emigrating to the field of communication from political science, and my immense respect for him as a scholar, practitioner, administrator, colleague, co-conspirator at times, and also as a friend. Ernest James Wilson III is the Walter Annenberg Chair in Communication and Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. He's also Professor of Political Science, a faculty fellow at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy at the Annenberg School at USC, a member of the board of the Pacific Council on International Policy, and a member of the National Academy's Computer Science and Telecommunications Board. He was elected chairman of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting in September 2009. Dean Wilson's experience at the intersection of communication and public policy spans the private and public sectors. He has served as a consultant to international agencies such as the World Bank and the United Nations, and worked in government at the White House National Security Council. Dean Wilson's other government experience includes, and this is only part of what he's done, service as Director of International Programs and Resources on the National Security Council at the White House, and Director of the Policy and Planning Unit, Office of the Director, U.S. Information Agency. And he has advised President Obama's transition team on matters of communication technology and public diplomacy. Nominated by President Clinton in 2000, Dean Wilson is the longest-serving member of the board of the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. That's got to be a really interesting job right now. As chair of the corporation, he has set an ambitious agenda for the nation's public media. He is founding chair of the board's new Digital Media Committee and Public Awareness Initiative Committee. He's also a member of the Carnegie Knight Commission on the Future of Journalism Education and the National Academy's Board on Research, Data, and Information. And he was Deputy Director of the Global Information Infrastructure Commission from 1994 to 1995. In addition to all that practical and applied experience, Dr. Wilson has an impressive academic resume, having been a member of, and often a leader of, research centers and academic departments at premier institutions of higher education, including, and this I think was his first academic position in political science, right here at the University of Pennsylvania. His current research interest concentrates on China-Africa relations, global sustainable innovation in high technology industries, and the role of politics in the diffusion of information and communication technologies. In addition to a very long list of articles, book chapters, essays, and books, Dr. Wilson co-edits the MIT Press series, The Information Revolution and Global Politics, and the journal Information Technologies and International Development. He is the recipient of numerous research and fellowships, including the Distinguished Scholar Award for the International Communications section of ISA, an International Affairs Fellowship from the Council on Foreign Relations, and a postdoctoral fellowship at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard University. Ernie earned his Ph.D. and M.A. in political science from the University of California, Berkeley, and a B.A. from Harvard College. The title of Dean Wilson's talk tonight, Bringing Communication to the Center, Reconciling Rigor and Relevance in the Communication Field, hints at the challenge he will present to those of us in this particular academic field, and promises to be both thought-provoking and perverse, and perhaps more. That's an interesting slip, and perhaps more than a little controversial. Though I have to say I am more than a little sympathetic to the argument that Professor Wilson is about to give us. So please join me in welcoming Dean Ernest James Wilson III.
I told Michael he gave away my punchline. But it really is an enormous honor to be invited to address you today. It's a great privilege to deliver the Walter and Leonore Annenberg Distinguished Lecture in Communication. It is also a pleasure to return to UPenn. I want to point out that I am wearing the appropriate tie. It's nonverbal communication. Not only did I reside in Low-Rise North, which some of you may know, but I also worked in Dietrich Hall and at what used to be called SPUP. I don't know if it's still the public policy. Fells, now they've been incorporated. Yeah. But probably more importantly, my wife got her Ph.D. here in history, and my son got his B.A. here in 1999 in English. So I have a great affection for the institution and a great affection for the city, not just the mustard pretzels, but this is sort of an ancestral home because my father grew up in Philadelphia and went to Central, and so every summer we would come up and do the whole Philly thing. So it really is a delight to come back and be with all of you today. And it's also a delight to be engaged in a conversation with our sister school. I was counting up the number of programs, Michael, that we do together, and it extends from summer programs for graduate students, for methodological training, the ASIMS program, the Compass program, which has taken our students together to Washington, D.C. We're working on a World Bank project, and there are a number of other things that we are currently doing. And I just want to say that working with Michael has been such a delight. I think of him as my older brother. Because he had his gig before I had my gig. And he has been he's been very helpful to me, both personally and professionally, in thinking about what it means to be a dean at an Annenberg school. And I think it really is a privilege to be a member of the Annenberg family. I see people in the audience who are members of other branches of the family, all cousins and brothers and sisters. And it really is, I think, a special relationship and one that we're looking forward to building on. You see that the ultimate Annenberg professor traveled here today also. This is Larry Gross, who is here. And he and Michael and I are this is the conspiracy part. We're concocting a relationship with the Social Science Research Council to add communication to their portfolio and pose the question, can we bring communication to the center, reconciling rigor and relevance in the communication field? That's not entirely the subject. I thought I would just bring that in. But we are doing that, and we think working together, it was a joint effort by our two schools. Last year, we had our first meeting that included the London School of Economics, University of Illinois, Michigan, Stanford, Northwestern, and the two Annenbergs. And so today's talk is going to be part of an ongoing conversation about the changing challenges and opportunities for the field of communication in the digital age, in the 21st century. And so this is a project that is continuing. We're also doing some work with Peking University in China on this same topic. So it is not only something that concerns those of us who are academics and practitioners in the United States, but also people in other parts of the world. I flew in to Philly from Abu Dhabi, where there was a conference, there was a media summit addressing many of these same interests. It was a bit more on the commercial side, but there was also university and intellectual representation. So it really is a delight to be able to share some of these ideas with you. And I plan only to talk for about an hour and a half to really communicate effectively. But I will try to stop at the appointed time, because I really do look forward to letting this be a discussion. But I do want to be a little perverse and provocative. And since he's like stolen my punchline, I think I'll just sort of lay it out there, which is that we all exist in an environment, an ecosystem of media and communication, which is changing radically. Look at the New York Times headline today about what AT&T is proposing. So we are probably, you and I, working in the field that is experiencing the greatest change in any area of society or economy or polity. So we're all in this together. The question that I put before you is, what is the role of communication school in participating in creative destruction? It's very easy to look outside and say, those creative destruction is going on over there in this organization or that organization. It's a little more difficult to look internally at our own institution, at universities, at schools of communication, at schools of journalism and media, and to ask, are we living up to the expectations and the demands of the moment? And for that, I would give us somewhere between a B and a B minus. Not any particular school, especially this school, and not my school, of course, but everybody else's school probably gets a B minus, or the field as a whole, let's put it that way, gets a B minus. And I'm going to try to explain what I mean by that. Now, the really cool part of this, of course, is that there's probably no field that's more exciting right now at the same time in terms of being able to work in this area. What James Benninger wrote 18 years ago in the summer of 1993 in the special issue of the Journal of Communication is still true today. And he wrote then, no Renaissance scholar could have asked for a more exciting or promising subject of study than contemporary communication. Never before have more disciplines or more minds converged more rapidly on a single phenomenon. It's a real privilege, I would say, to be a little bit corny about it, that it's a real privilege to be working in this field. It's a real opportunity, and especially, I would say, the two Annenbergs and other leading institutions have an opportunity to shape not only the academy, not only our field, but every other field in the academy, and also the practice of communication as it extends in the United States and around the world. But as I said, I'm a little pessimistic about where we are right now. I'm going to give you, maybe just take 2 seconds to give a little bit of sort of personal biography that will explain why I'm going to say the hopefully radical, perverse things that I hope to say. When I was here and really enjoyed my 3 years, I was in the pre-renovation Dietrich Hall. Probably very few people remember. I saw some people wince. So you remember pre-renovation Dietrich Hall. But I also had an appointment at the public policy school. So I was interdisciplinary at that point. I then went to the University of Michigan, where I was sort of triply appointed, the policy school, political science, as well as the African American Studies program, because I was doing a lot of research on Africa. I stayed there for a number of years and then went to Merrill and had another triple appointment in a discipline, a field, and an area. And so by that I want to suggest that I've been wrestling with these issues of what the heck is a discipline? What is a field? What is an area? These questions that have also bedeviled and engaged experts and great thinkers in the field of communication. The other little bit of intellectual biography that I just want to put on the table is that among the books that Michael cited, there are a couple of them that have tried to work out an issue that I've been wrestling with for a number of years, which I think has special resonance in the field of communication, and that is the relationship, the balance between structure on the one hand and agency on the other. This is an issue that I think has got to be central to any research paradigm or program, and certainly one as important as communication. So in the Information Revolution in Developing Countries, which looked at Brazil, China, and Ghana, and then a book that I edited on negotiating the net in Africa, the effort was to look at that relationship between individual initiative on the one hand and the institutional structures, the social structures that constrain initiative on the other. I then took that same idea and extended it to the international level in a book with the really boring title of Global Governance of Electronic Networks. Even I get bored with even saying that. But the purpose of the book really was to say, look at the structure and agency question. And a lot of the work in this field tends to look at structure and agency from the perspective of the North. What is the Washington Consensus? What is Washington trying to do internationally to impose its will? The purpose of this book was to bring together, through a Social Science Research Council initiative, people from the South and the outside. So the perspective was, what does the communication world look like from the bottom up and the outside in, rather than the top down and the inside out? So that, again, is another question of structure and agency, and I want to come back to both of those themes as I walk through this paper. So let me suggest then, report to you on some conversations that I've had over the past 3.5 or 4 years since I've been dean. One is with practitioners. A second is with scholars in our traditional fields, sociology, economics, and also with people who train professionals, i.e. law schools, business schools, etc. One of the surprising things that I noticed, I asked one of my colleagues to look at the ways in which economics begins to treat media, communication, and related topics, and the way in which communication journals are treating economics. May I have my slide, please? Can you guess which is which? This is the attention that economics is paying to our topic. And of course, we're delighted about that. This is the attention that we are paying to their topic. Now, I don't want to overinterpret this slide or suggest that it is definitive or applicable universally, but it does say something about the growing scholarly interest in the work that is typically within our domain. Now, this is going to be my only slide. I tend to believe that power corrupts, and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. And so this will be my only slide, and I will make, if I have time, I will make one little drawing on that whiteboard over there. That will be my multimedia, which completely humiliates my friends when they see me do this, but I'm going to do that anyway. So let me tell you a little story. As part of being dean of Annenberg West, I've been trying to understand the communities of practice as well as the scholarly communities that interact with our school. So the scholarly part is relatively easy because I can talk to people in political science departments, economics departments, etc. And also people who train engineers or physicians or people at business schools. Rather more difficult, but equally interesting, has been conversations with non-scholarly types, practitioners, I'll call them. So here's a story about a story, which is an appropriate thing for a communications person to talk about. So this guy comes into my office. He's the CEO of one of the largest foundations in California. And here's the story he told. Once upon a time, that was not his language, but it's mine. Once upon a time, we knew what we were doing. Giving away, at a base of $7 billion, they give away a lot of money. Once upon a time, we knew what we were doing. Then the internet came along and messed things up, and then we didn't know what we were doing. But then we finally learned to do what we were doing again and sort of use this internet thing called it. And so we were happy. Then, unfortunately, along came social media, and we don't have a clue about what we're doing anymore. Could you help us? And what I discovered is in talking to CEOs of large corporations, community groups, practitioners not only in the United States but in other parts of the world, there was this similar request for assistance. Sometimes it was explicit, sometimes it was implicit. But sort of the question was, can you help us understand this thing that's going on? Because we really don't get it. We have engineers, they don't get it. We have business people, they get a piece of it. We have, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But then they asked the question which motivates my discussion this evening. They said, can you help us out in understanding this? And then they posed this question. What is communication? What are the unique communication competencies that you or your students bring to the table that graduates of other disciplines and fields do not? As one CEO put it in very commercial terms, what is the premium that your students bring to the table? Now, these discussions become especially robust when the individuals that I am speaking with are talking about teamwork and teams. So they will often say, for example, I can no longer have my company or my nonprofit work just individually in silos. People have to get together and talk in teams. And they say, if I hire a neoclassical economist, I know what I'm getting. If I hire a lawyer, I know what I'm getting. If I hire an engineer, linear, ABC, build stuff, etc., I know what I'm getting. So they would turn to me and they'd say, Dr. Wilson, tell us what we're getting if I hire a communication student. At which point I would mumble and fumble and wrestle with that issue. So I'm going to flip this around. This little audience, silent audience participation, which is, if you were asked that question, what is the unique competency that communication brings to such a table, what would your answer be? So hold that thought. Hold that. What would the answer be if you were invited into a community organization or a health organization or what have you? What would the answer be? Well, I didn't have an answer, so I sat down with something that used to be called a yellow pad and a pencil and wrote out the following 5 things that I think are common to what we do as a field. Now, let me preface this by saying a couple things. 1, it's not the only thing. 2, the list is too short. 3, it represents the perspective of me as an individual and also my institutional base. I get that. I've also done this sufficiently to know that the response may be, A, how dare you suggest this such a list? B, you forgot my field. And C, we don't do that in communication. I get them, that's fine. But I got 10 years, so I figure I'd try it anyway. Number one, communication at its earliest core has an ancient, once widely appreciated tradition of deep inquiry into the meanings behind the words we speak and write, and those meanings are framed, and how those meanings are framed and communicated. That's the rhetorical tradition. Okay? I think, by the way, my punchline with this is really cool stuff, and it's really, really valuable, but nobody knows it in sort of an organized, systematic way. 2, the field opens up a black box that other disciplines and fields leave closed by problematizing the distinctions and relations among, very familiar to everyone in this room, sender, receiver, message, channel, and context. We open that up. We really problematize it. We really pay attention to that when others do not. Unlike other disciplines, our work is not complete unless we know something of the context, the societal, moral, ethical, physical context within which communication occurs. By the way, the single thing in talking to people at IBM, Weber Shandwick, Amgen, other companies, the single thing they're looking for in people they hire and people they promote is the ability, quote, to connect the dots. They said, we need people who can think 360 degrees because they get the context. We do that. That's what communication does. Thirdly, we have a deep respect for the audience and its own interpretation and definition of meanings, which in turn reflects and produces a normative commitment to democratic values, I argue, to the voices of the voiceless, and an associated respect for popular culture, which not all fields have. I'm sorry to run through this so quickly, but I don't want to take too much time. The field is quite tolerant of studying a wide range of problems and topics at many levels of social action and abstraction, from micro to macro to meso in between. And finally is the field's long-standing practice of multidisciplinarity and its rhetorical commitment to interdisciplinarity. Now, I think that makes us unique. But there's a great irony in this field, which is that we study communications. This is some of the coolest stuff going, and we don't communicate it very well to people who aren't in the field of communication. That's a curious irony. So let me just take a minute to talk about the final point that I raised of interdisciplinarity. My hunch is that as we continue to make our mark in the field of communication, one of the things that makes us really unique is that we take interdisciplinarity very seriously. In part because the field itself is filled with people from a whole bunch of different disciplines. The core are people who got Ph.D.s in communication, but many others come from psychology or sociology, etc. So we have a respect for that. Secondly, our field, as you know very well, is interdisciplinary by its nature. So I think that lends us respect for interdisciplinarity. The problem is that we give sort of lip service to interdisciplinarity, but we practice multidisciplinarity. Okay? We give lip service to interdisciplinarity, but we practice multidisciplinarity. And I don't have time to go into details on that, but in a sentence, what I mean by that is that multidisciplinarity means I respect what you are doing in your discipline, and you can train your graduate students in that, and I won't mess with you. In return, you will respect what I do in my silo, in my subdiscipline, which you respect, but you won't mess with my graduate students or what I teach. Interdisciplinarity by contrast, and there's a new Oxford handbook on interdisciplinarity. There's got to be an easier way. I call it ID, interdisciplinarity. That means that you are a sociologist or a communication person or an engineering person, and I'm something else, and we sit down and we take a common problem. And you contribute what is great about your discipline, I contribute what is great for my discipline, and we create a third thing that is neither one or the other. I think if we can do that, as the economists used to say, we'll take over all of the world. If you believe a lot that's being written both in scientific magazines as well as in business magazines and academic magazines, innovation is taking place where? It's taking place at the edges. Not so much at the core, but at the intersections of bodies of knowledge. And if we can teach our graduate students to the rules of engagement, of interdisciplinarity, then I think that will give us an advantage going into the future that other fields will copy because they will see how important it is. And I'm going to say a bit more about graduate education in just a moment. And I think there are reasons, but in order to do that, this is another bit of an irony, which is that in order to become more interdisciplinary, I think we also have to become more disciplinary. So a bit of a contradiction, but if you're going to be truly interdisciplinary, and you are going to work in a team, as most of you who are graduate students will spend your life, whether you're in the academy or in outside of the academy, you'll be working in teams more than my generation. When you go to those teams, you have to know what you're bringing to the table. Not just your Ph.D. dissertation topic, which even you will be bored with in 5 years, if any luck at all, if you grow intellectually. I mean, dissertation is just something you do along the way. I know some of the graduate students say, how dare you say that? My wife. No, you're not saying that. Okay. Good. You've learned. That's great. So you've got to master a discipline. You've really got to know it cold. You've got to know what excellence is. You've got to know the relationship between, and no matter what field, you've got to understand the relationship between theory and concepts and empirical work. And how to make an argument. And you've got to master a field before you become interdisciplinary. So we're talking about interdisciplinary over career, not interdisciplinary by the time you walk. One look at this walk here. So this is a ongoing project, but I do think it's hugely important. But in order to become more interdisciplinary and less multidisciplinary, each of us has to master what it means to have a core body of knowledge, which I suggested to you earlier consisted of those 5 things. So that's my slightly ironical argument about the relationship between core discipline and interdisciplinarity. Now, let me say, I'm going to end up this talk by suggesting some concrete things that the field of communication should do in terms of teaching, research, and service. That's pretty much what universities are doing, those 3 things: teaching, research, and service. But before I get there, I want to suggest to you one other thing to think about. And this is really just a thing to think about. And this is the communication at the center piece. If we're going to have a broader impact on the academy and on the world of practice more broadly, we need certain kinds of framing mechanisms which will situate our argument in ways that are accessible to other people while demonstrating the great strengths of communication, the ones that I have talked about. One way to think about that is what I call communication at the center. And the argument there is that in a post-industrial society, what characterizes what we are seeing is that the activities of communication, the technologies of communication, thinking about communication is moving from a slightly more peripheral position toward the center. So it's a movement from peripheral or periphery to center. And that we should think about that at 3 different levels. One, at the very macro level of society. Secondly, at the organizational group or meso level of society. And thirdly, at the micro level of society. And of course, different people in this room slice into that in different ways. Some of you work at macro level, some of you work at individual level of cognitive engagement and learning, and some of you work with organizations. None of those I'm not privileging any one of those. None is better than the other. I mean, I have certain preferences. Actually, I sort of like to work across all three, which is maybe why I'm proposing this. But let me just put on the, since I've got the technology here, I'm going to draw about 5 lines. I'll say micro, meso, and macro. And all I want to leave you with this evening is that you might give some thought to the ways in which our field of communication addresses each of those issues. So who are the leading authors in communication that might look at this, for example? What are the problems that are associated with each level? What about non-communication scholars? So the point I want to make, ladies and gentlemen, is that as we think about what makes our field unique, we have to communicate that to other scholars and to practitioners. And that the argument I would make is that if you are trying to make a decision as an individual in the field of communication and trying to understand these technologies and these flows and structures, you need to consider these two things as well. When I have made this argument to hard-bitten practitioners in Abu Dhabi or France or New York or San Francisco up in Silicon Valley, they say, oh yeah, that's what we're trying to do. Because you can't just make a decision here and not have it be impacted by this and this, especially when change is taking place so rapidly. Okay. So I'm going to bring this toward an end here by suggesting, let me recapitulate a little bit of what I'm saying, which is that we're in the middle of this incredibly exciting revolution that's taking place. And it is impacting all institutions in the fields of communication. NGOs, government agencies, nonprofits, foundations, and also the university. How should the university respond to these changes? That's sort of the big question. As my friend Dr. Gross reminds me, we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater on this because universities have been around for 1,000 years. And we don't want to hop on the latest trend and fad just to be trendy. Because we have some enduring values of investigation of issues, a commitment to objectivity, to truth, to explaining things in ways that are low and sophisticated. I don't think, however, that prevents us from also trying experiments. And that's another point I want to leave you with tonight, is that some of the stuff that we should try to do, and some of you are already doing, especially at the place, I mean, I know what you're doing at Penn, and I know the experiments that you are taking here at the University of Pennsylvania. My only point is that more schools need to take more risks in this crazy environment we're living in. Otherwise, we'll be left behind. And that's a strong version. Otherwise, we will become curios, but we will not have stepped up to the great potential that we can achieve. So let me just rattle off, if I may, then, 3 things we can do. And I don't know if any of you have had the pleasure of reading through the ferment at the in the field journals. They come out sort of every 10 years. And it happens in all fields. I mean, economics does it and political science does it. And they say, oh, what shall we become? Who are we? It's a very existential cri de coeur coming out of the academic journals. And it's rather humbling because all those brilliant thoughts that one thinks one had in noticing this, other people noticed 10 years ago and 20 years ago and 30 years ago. But what is rather distressing is that they're still around 10 years, 20 years, 30 years later. So I think if we are going to seize the moment, we have got to be slightly more action-oriented and say, if we believe that we can become the queen, the king of the social sciences, or knowledge creation in a knowledge society. This is a bit bold, but why not be bold? What do we have to do? Well, we have to do something about teaching, we have to do something about research, and we have to do something about what is called service. So I'm going to rattle off some things which I hope are controversial, but maybe not, to suggest that ways that the communication field can become even better. Okay? I said even better. All students, graduate and undergraduate, should be required to know the core unique elements of the field that distinguishes it from others. In other words, you shouldn't be able to get out of Penn or University of Southern California without knowing what the hell you're studying. Not what your professor is studying, but what the field is studying. That's point number one. No graduate student should be able to graduate without demonstrating mastery of the logic and literatures of the dominant subfields. If you're a rhetoric person, you ought to be able to do the social science thing. If you're a social science person, you ought to be able to know the rhetoric thing sufficiently well to be able to stand up and articulate and teach it in a graduate class. That, to me, is the ultimate test. Without knowing which of these fields you prefer. I actually did this in political economy for 20 years, and it can be done. You can do Marxism, and you can do neoclassical economics, and develop respect for each of those approaches. 3, require every graduate student to take a minimum number of seminars in the performance and engagement of genuine interdisciplinarity. Means more work for the graduate student, more work for the professors. Nobody likes that idea, but it's probably a good thing. Encourage all communication students to experience working within an interdisciplinary team. I think that should be true for every graduate student, not just the finally, communication programs should offer more courses in substantive areas that are now overlooked. And these things go in waves. Some years ago, political economy was a hot topic. Now, it's not a hot topic. Now, your school and my school are hiring in political economy. But you know what? It's a very thin pool. This interest in political economy has done this. It used to be up here and like this. So these things go in waves. So there are overlooked things like economics, political economy, public policy, the logic of technology and engineering. Not engineering, but the logic of these things. And this is just my own personal list. We could add 10 other things that are probably being under-examined in the research, rather than the graduate program. Okay, so that's what needs to be done on the pedagogy side. And of course, more fellowships for graduate students. How's that for pandering? We need to learn some of these things. Research. I sort of talked enough about that, I think. Add the topics, diversify the research base, do more stuff like this that is integrative, preferably at the level of research. And then finally, I'm going to end on a note of what used to be called service. Now, most of you probably know that, when we get evaluated as professors every year, we have to fill in a form. The graduate students may not know this, but we have to fill in a form. And the form says, what have you published, what have you taught, and what service have you done? We hate doing it. It's a pain, but you don't get raises unless you do it. Right? Even as you speak. So we all get to do this. So the current definition of service is sort of like jury duty. Okay, you got to do stuff for the department, you got to do stuff for the school, you serve on university committees, blah, 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 blah. But also national organizations. For example, the International Communications Association counts as service. So that's a lot of work. As are other contributions, serving on other boards or committees, etc. So what I want to do, though, is to change the definition of service to what I would call engagement. And I called it engagement, and this is where the relevance part of my title comes in. Rigor and relevance. Because service is too narrow a term. We have got to get out off the campus and engage with the communities of practice and the citizenry and the groups for whom we either prepare our students or we prepare knowledge and analysis for those communities. It is salutary to go sit and listen to people who every day are trying to make their way and do good things in the world, sometimes even bad things in the world, and to listen to their perspectives. Now, in some ways, I know I'm preaching to the converted, but the conversation here is not only about the two Annenbergs, but it's more broadly about the field as a whole. And so I'm just going to bring this to a conclusion by saying that it is enormously helpful for us to get out and listen to what others are saying they need from us, because that should affect our curriculum, the design of our courses and curriculum. It should affect the research that we do. It should affect a variety of things that we have to do in our professional lives, filtered, of course, through our need as an academy for arm's length, integrated, and respectful treatment of the traditions of universities and great universities. So I'm not suggesting we become even think tanks or even become consultancies, but I would just urge it. And this is happening. I mean, and maybe in Q&A I can talk a little bit about some concrete examples of engagement. So let me conclude then by saying that, especially for those of you who are graduate students, this is a pretty cool time to be a graduate student. I mean, all I can tell you, it's a pretty cool time to be a professor and a dean in the field of communication. Because every place I go, people say, tell us about communication. And for some of us who have worked at the periphery of important topics, it's kind of cool to be paid attention to. This is what we fight for in intellectual life. Women, gender studies, African American studies, environmental studies. They used to they were like completely peripheral and unimportant. And now, because of certain kinds of struggles and engagement, they become more central. And the same thing is happening in communication. People really are paying attention to this. So I would conclude by saying that we have arrived at a rare moment, everybody in this room, when so much seems new and possible to us. And when societies around the world, perhaps naively, but looking at Libya and Egypt, perhaps not so naively, when societies around the world are seeking out the insights, interpretations, and advice and wisdom that we can give to them, let's not let them down. Whatever happens to our field, let's not let them down. All it takes is imagination, a common vision, willpower, and hard work. Thank you very much.
So we have about 10 or 12 minutes for question and answer. Anyone would like to start us off?
Yes, ma'am.
Well, I'm going to take you up on your intuition and some of what you say might be controversial. And I understand very well, and I think anybody who lives in an institution understands very well, the lust for the center. But you also talked about the idea that innovation happens at the edges. And I don't quite know how to put those two things together, and wonder what you mean by that. And I'm thinking particularly of your idea about the core curriculum being a marker of the center in a certain way. And I think that's an ongoing debate, certainly, in communication programs. But the multidisciplinarity of communication is one of the things, as it is practiced, I think, in the academy, is one of the things that has made it very innovative. And so I am wondering how you reconcile your idea about the value of innovation at the periphery with this strong push that above all, the important thing is to have to move to the center.
That's a very good question. It's a very good question. I try to answer it the following way: that there's the center, there's the center, and then there's periphery. We are. Let me put it this way: when I talk to folks in other fields, and I say, "Here's what we can bring to the table: our multidisciplinarity, our interdisciplinarity, our respect for context, our respect for the popular." I sometimes feel this is the first time they've heard this argument about the role, about the contribution that communication can uniquely make. Now, some of that may be just a function of our past inability to communicate this to others. But I, don't necessarily want to say that's the only reason. But I think there is kind of an insularity that makes this work. So I would say that by communication at the center, I mean also bring it to the center of public debate. Some of it is sort of empirical, sort of GDP questions. I mean, the macroeconomy more of that's being contributed by communication industries, or communication firms, or people working in communication jobs. But I think that we are too far in the periphery right now, and that we have not been effectively communicating with other disciplines, with professional training, and with practitioners. I think there could be a risk of being maybe over-centralized, creating a kind of iron, what do they call it? Iron cage that would be monodisciplinary. But if there's any field in the world that I'm not worrying about being monodisciplinary, it's communication. So I would say on the kind of engagement question, that you pose a very interesting question, but I think empirically, we are sufficiently outside of people's ken about the unique things that we can provide, that we can get a lot closer to the center of the academy or practice without worrying about being overly centralized. So I'm not sure where that's a word. I mean, sort of, that eventually may be a worry. But I think at this point in the evolution of the field of communication, I worry more about this and the unfamiliarity that people have, practitioners as well as other scholars, with our field, than I am about the over-centralization. There's sort of a parallel question someone from Singapore once said, and this is the danger of using at the center. I said, well, it should be communication at the core. Because there's a whole debate and discourse about decentering. And I'm sensitive to that, so I'm looking actually maybe for another term, but a colleague from Singapore said, well, I like this idea, come to Singapore and talk about it, but we think we're the core, he said, because he's from Singapore, and Singapore's doing all sorts of interesting things with communication and creativity and innovation. So the term center, I agree, is sort of problematic. But I haven't come up with one yet that I can use to replace it. Yes, Mr.
Thank you. I'm still not clear what you mean by communication. Right? I mean, you haven't defined it, and you distinguish in the school title, probably for political reasons, distinguish between journalism and communication. But it's a tough problem. I mean, how do you even think of what communication means? You've talked around it, but you really haven't described particulars of what you mean. What are the boundaries as you see them, and why?
Yeah. Well, I actually disagree. I think I have defined it. I haven't described it so much, but I think I have defined it. As you know as well as I do, this is such a thorny, such a thorny issue, a controversial issue, of whether or not one should even attempt to put boundaries around communication. One of the great lessons that I learned through our Social Science Research Council project is that we had 6 schools, and we talked about many others. The heterogeneity of these schools is mind-boggling. Northwestern has a school of theater. We have public relations in our school. I mean, who knew? And so the challenge with that is that, let's say, whereas pick either a discipline or a field, law, religion, or profession, there's a certain amount of homogeneity across these institutions, which I think makes it easier to create an intellectual agreement about boundaries. But if we have institutions which are literally all over the map and all over the map, it becomes harder to define. But I would say we lose more by failing to define the boundaries than not doing so. And I think discipline means this is what I do and this is what I don't do. If you say everybody communicates, so I do everything, that's a little extreme for me. If you say this is what I do and I define this and only this as communication, that's also too extreme. So these 5 elements of the field of communication, I really do think capture, maybe, certainly not everything, but a bunch of what distinguishes those of us in the room when we sit down at the table with people from other disciplines or other fields that is unique to us. And I've given 5 of them. Could be 7, I'm not sure, could be 3. But I think that is the intellectual challenge in some ways for us and for the next generation. To make a decision as to whether or not that's a battle they want to fight. It's a very difficult battle to fight right now because we are so siloed. But my deep, deep concern, based not on just my conversations in the academy, but conversations with people in Abu Dhabi who have just come back from Cairo, or people at National Public Radio, or people in South Central who are trying to understand this new world in which they're living. We need to be able to provide some answers. And if we say, I'm not worried, we do everything, that's not so helpful. So, can more be done? Absolutely. But I think these 5 are at least a start in trying to put some boundaries. Kathleen?
Suppose we have one of our doctoral students, could be yours, Lizzie, could be yours, and the person is trying to make a case for the uniqueness against a doctoral student in cultural anthropology and sociolinguistics. So we've got 3 of them. Right. In what sense can the communication student make a case for your 5 that the other 2 can't make?
That's sort of an inverse of a point that was pointed out to me by Sandra Ball O'Keefe, who teaches at USC Annenberg. And her point, very interesting one, also Peggy McLaughlin makes the same point, which is that each field does interdisciplinary cooperation in slightly different ways. So the way an economist does interdisciplinarity is not the same thing as a cultural anthropologist would do interdisciplinarity. So in a perfect world, what we would do, I don't think there'd be the second version of the Oxford study of interdisciplinarity that would really go by field and sort of run them against other fields. To think about the mechanics, what Anne Balsamo talks about, the rules of engagement of one discipline with another discipline. So I'm not sure I can, if I knew more about each of the other fields, I could probably answer it. But I think that those are questions which, if we want to enhance the dare I say, rigor, and the relevance of the field, we're going to have to start doing more of that and treating it in as serious a way as we treat other competencies, mathematical or quantitative competencies, or other qualitative competencies. Yes, sir.
Yeah. You asked a rhetorical question. I hope it wasn't rhetorical. What would we say when asked, what do communication students bring to the table? I'd have said the answer is empathy. That is the ability to understand where others are coming from, which is surprisingly difficult, actually, even to understand what they're saying sometimes, but it's also to understand why they are saying what they're saying, or trying to communicate what they're saying, and actually also what they're trying to communicate really underneath or even against what is actually being announced. But then, I thought, well, actually, if you have that level of empathy, then that is radically disqualifying you from action. You can see that everybody has their reasons. And I think that's one of the problems with the kind of holistic notion of communication studies that you're offering, is that once you've got to a point where you can understand all the determinants upon a particular enunciation, a particular communicative system or situation, then does that not mean that there is nothing more to be said, and certainly no position can be taken?
Paul Pot. I think I really understood Paul Pot. I looked at his rhetoric, I looked at what he was saying, I looked at what he was doing. I think there were reasons of personality, there were reasons of culture, there were reasons of isolation of that part of the world from other parts of the world, even though it was his own region. I think intellectually and cognitively I understood that, and yet I thought action should be taken. But you raise we don't want to say that too much knowledge is a bad thing and leads us to inaction. And what I come back to again and again to many of these questions is, we're working with a group in South Central LA. It's an area called Alhambra. There's 1/3 Latino, 1/3 Asian, and 1/3 Caucasian. They don't have, and they have, each of them has a newspaper or radio station that speaks in that language. They don't have a common platform. They don't have a common medium to talk to one another. So they said, this isn't a good thing, they said. Can you help us fix that? So I can't, I just feel it's not responsible to be able to say, well, that's, how can I say this? We don't do that, or we tell you the 60 things that we do, or I think we have a kind of a civic responsibility to try to answer these questions. Again, I think they tend to be put mainly in scholarly academic terms. But I guess if there's one thing that maybe I'm trying to say today is that the debate about the importance of communication should be carried on with the people who say they want to communicate more effectively. And I think if we start doing that, it will change the nature of our internal debate. Rather than saying, hey, look, I do political economy. And that's the most important thing. You really have to understand when ownership structures, all the stuff about cultural this and rhetorical that, it's irrelevant. I'm going to really be rigid about it. I think that's a stupid approach. It's a particular approach. And I think if we're going to move forward, both to be more intellectually powerful and really help people in South Central or Egypt or South Philly or West Philly, wherever, then that is a conservation development that we wish. If we can do that.
So, Bernie, just this notion of what a core curriculum might look like. We struggled with that. I've struggled with it. You don't ever come to any agreement on it or not. do you have thoughts when you put a table like that together as to what would in fact fall? Can you deal with this by looking at the history of the field rather than trying to say these are the things people need to know?
I think that, I mean, again, I think most of us have courses in the evolution of the field. And I think that's probably, when I was a graduate student, that was one of the most helpful things that I had in the course I ever taught. And so now I understand why. Because it's a historical, cultural artifact. This is rather static. But I think the utility of this thing is not necessarily looking at its evolution, but to say there are really smart people who do this and they're in communication. And there are really smart people who do this, and there are really smart people who do this, and I should know something about that.
And you guys at USC tried to figure out a way of grappling with this, either reading lists, asking faculty or students what the one book is.
This is a theoretical discussion.
Yeah, well, one thing I like about it is it's both theoretical and not. And so, this issue is a really tricky one about why are we all, what makes us, what's common enough about us that we're all in this building working together. I like the diversity, and I feel like there is something that distinguishes us from other parts of the university, not completely, but what that is, and does it matter that we know it, is a really interesting question.
And I think that, again, we actually are reviewing, as I'm sure many, many schools of communication and journalism, we're reviewing our entire curriculum. We just, I live in a school that has a PR department, a journalism school, and a communication school, which has multiple flavors. And then we have at least 13 or 14 research and training centers that gives a BA, an MA, and a Ph.D. professional certificates. I think that's a good thing. Some days I think it's a terrible thing, some days. But most days I think that because the world is going toward that kind of convergence, I convince myself it's a good thing. But it means harder work. But I think that we are at a kind of a potential inflection point. And we either get this right or we really miss an opportunity.
Well, I think that's what that shows.
Right. This is sort of this is the stick, I guess. If we don't get this right, then the economists will eat our lunch. What worse group? Eat our lunch. The other thing, if we don't do it right, we fail a whole bunch of people around the world who need this knowledge. Again, having just come back from the Gulf, from the Middle East, how dare we not provide some kind of knowledge, necessary knowledge, as Craig Calhoun called it, to help people make their way in the world between structure and agency. More information can probably help people understand that space between structure and agency. So, and again, I think, as you know, this is one of the things we're going to try to do with the Social Science Research Council. Wrestle with people. I'm going to take two more. Here, and then again.
My question actually has to do with the graph. And I think one of the reasons why I think it would be very difficult to reverse those lines is because everyone does do communication. It is universal in that sense. People who do economics can't not communicate. Right? They're using social media, they're using media, they're talking face to face. Whereas all people who are doing communication are not inherently doing economics. So how do we begin? We can't, as a field, own communication.
Right. Well, see, but look at this. I spent 20 years teaching economics, and in the Journal of Economic Literature, which is this thick, comes out quarterly, nobody paid much attention to communication. Actually, Williamson here looked at transaction costs. And so there is this very interesting, going back to the 18th century, there is a little itty-bitty conversation about information, data flows, knowledge, more recently, the knowledge economy. So that's what explains it. So I agree that there might be a greater emphasis on communication in economics. But this is look at this uptick.
That's the invention of the web right there.
Yeah.
That 1994 is when the
Yeah,
web.
but this isn't usage.
No.
This
But
is
that's when
analysis.
articles started coming out. That's exactly when the web, with the browser, was invented.
Right.
And that clearly economists were taken by that, and it exploded.
Well, arguably, there's some. It's not unimportant to know about economics these days. We might not have had the crisis, the economic crash that we did, which I blame in part on American stenography rather than journalism. Because Secretary Paulson would come out and say, here's what we need to do, here's a 2-page statement, and too many of the journalists said, okay, thank you very much, I'll publish that. And that if communication/journalism/media had been smarter or more concerned with economic issues, then maybe the slope of this line would have been a little bit less. But look at this guy. Now again, I don't want to read too much into this. This is one, and there are all sorts of methodological flaws. That I won't go into here. But even if we reduce it by half, it's worth a conversation. And one of the things that we've been trying to do at UFC, I just want to mention 2 quick things. And I'm going to go to the gentleman in green. One is that we are creating a track, undergraduate track and a graduate track, eventually, on media economics and entrepreneurship. Because we think if you don't understand media economics, you can't be a good journalist and you can't be a good citizen or scholar in communication. Now that's broadly defined, entrepreneurship and economics, and clearly the entrepreneurship appeals more to those in the major in journalism or something like this. The second thing we're doing in terms of engagement is we created something called the Annenberg Innovation Laboratory. Some of you may remember the MIT Media Lab. They did 75% gadgets and 25% usability. We're doing 75% usability, context, society, etc., and 25% gadgets. So we created this lab. The students have really embraced it. The faculty is much involved, and I'm delighted as a dean because Microsoft and Verizon and Intel and Mattel and Levi Strauss and about 4 or 5 other corporations have said, oh, that's sufficiently interesting that we want to come play. So they've given a little chunk of change. It's not enough to, but it's still a chunk of change. And deans always worry about chunks of change, as we know. But I think that is the kind of, I don't want to toot our own horn, but I do think, because I know that there are things going on at this school that are equally innovative. But I'd like us to open up a spirit of innovation. Try some things that fail. We can sunset these things. We can try a program, try it for 3 years, doesn't work, throw it in the garbage can. But that, we're lucky, and you're lucky, and we're lucky because we have a little bit of extra resources to take the risk of failure without going out of business or having the provost beat us about the head and face. But I do think that therefore, whom much is given, much is expected. And so we can take the risk. It's not going to, if we lose some money, it's not going to tell us. It may wound us seriously, but it won't. Yes, sir.
I'm a business person, and I deal a fair amount with entrepreneurs. And I also deal with different industries. And what I've determined is that most of these industries are siloed, just as academic facilities are. They all speak a different language. As effective communicators, and I go back to the McLuhan model and so forth, but I think the economists had a real jump on the communication side, because communication is impacted by so many of these other disciplines, the law, technology, sociology, politics, economics. And unless we understand as communicators how these different disciplines impact us, I don't believe we can accurately describe ourselves to these other disciplines where we're supposed to be going in and helping them execute. I think it's one thing to articulate the model. It's one thing to look at the other guy's problems and stuff like that. But it's also because we are pretty facile because of our training to go in and understand what the other guy's doing. It's also important for us to be able to help direct the other guy and show him the way, since we're, in the land of the blind, the one-eyed man is king. So, maybe you'd like to...
I think that's an important, and again, part of my thinking on this has been spent, because I've been sort of systematically across these various industries. So I met with the top 5 CEOs of public relations, Weber Shandwick, Hilda Knowlton, Atkinson. Then I met with the senior communications and marketing officers for the Fortune 50 companies, and then with marketing people, trying to understand them. And one of the things very striking, I did a little piece, I won't tell you where I wrote it, but anyway, I published a little piece about how these things are affecting the corporation. And you may find this interesting. There's sort of 3 or 4 challenges. One is that the executive suite tends to be distant historically from the communications function. It's kind of an org-com question. I mean, it's true for corporations, but it's also true for the World Bank. It's also true for foundations. So the CEO is here, and the communication people are here, and the CEO doesn't understand communication. And most of the communication people don't understand big strategy. So they don't talk to you. Now, where you bring those two together, you are beginning to find that in the leadership cadre, in the leadership suite, the lawyer tends to look at lawyerly questions and say no to everything. The CFO looks mainly at the bottom line. The chief technology officer looks at the technology geeky bandwidth kind of stuff. The only person potentially in the C-suite who has responsibility for protecting the brand is the comm guy. And so if she comes in and says, well, you say you do A, B, and C, but if you're doing D and E, you can't do that because everybody will Twitter and tweet and blog, and you will be completely exposed in the marketplace and go down in flames. So you have this kind of odd juxtaposition where PR folks, there are any PR people in the room, I apologize in advance, but the PR folks tend to be seen as just trying to sell it no matter what. John Iwata, who is the head of IBM's corporate communication, probably the leader in the field, had a meeting in New York recently where he invited for the top 20 companies in Fortune 50 the chief communication officer, but they had to come with their chief financial officer and their chief legal officer to try to figure out how these conversations could begin to take place. And so the other piece of this is that there used to be PR, there used to be corporate communication, and there used to be more advertising. The distinction among them is going bye-bye. And so you talk to these CEOs and senior people, they don't know who the hell to hire and for what purpose. Now that's probably a little bit less relevant to this school because you train most folks in Ph.D.s, right? Well, we were talking yesterday, I talked to the CEO of one of the leading public relations companies. I said, we've got to hire somebody in this field. Should we hire a really good practitioner, or should we hire a fuzzy-headed Ph.D., an academic, theoretical? I said, go with the academic. Because we need people who are going to look at questions in profound, research-based ways, because the industry is changing and going upside down and inside out. In public relations, as it is in music, in newspapers, in everything that we study, all of these industries are changing radically. And so I think we have to figure out, as you're suggesting, ways to both analyze and understand that better, and also engage with the communities of practice that we provide students work and research work. You have a final question because you're the boss.
Oh, there's many that would disagree with that one. But just a real quick question, just to follow up on the rhetorical aspect of what you were saying, and as someone who doesn't really get to play in theory too much, what is the answer that your admissions folks give when they're asked what is communication?
At the undergraduate or graduate level?
You have more answers to that than we do.
Let me give you an interesting statistic. I think it's interesting. For the undergraduate communication program, 40% of the majors are internal transfers. 40% of the majors are internal transfers, which suggests to me that before they get to the Annenberg School, they don't know what communication is. They know they're really interested in understanding it. They intuitively know that sort of, communication is the new liberal arts in some ways. But 40% are transfer. I think Larry's argument is sort of the centrality of communication. I mean, that's what distinguishes human beings from non-human beings, from animals, that we are communicative people, and that is the center of what we do. What else would we say, Larry?
You said what I want you to say. You said you don't understand the world if you don't get this. And the world is changing, so the more you get it, the more you'll be able to adapt and succeed in this kind of changing world.
Okay, I am going to stop us on that note. Thank you very much.